Hello, this is Don Milne. I'm making this video called The Goldielocks Zone, What to Include in Stories Behind the Stars Stories. And I think it may prove helpful for people to kind of get an idea of what kind of stuff do you leave in, what kind of stuff do you leave out. Remember, the main audience we have for Stories Behind the Stars are those people reading these stories on a smartphone at a gravesite or memorial. Often someone they're not related to, but they're interested in that person because they see their name there and they want to learn a little bit more. So here's some tips on some things to include. Try to go for like 400 to 1,000 words. Something like that can be read within a few minutes on a smartphone. You are scrolling up and down on a phone, so it is a little bit unique medium of how to read. So a 20,000 word document probably isn't going to be the best experience to do that on a smartphone. We hope you can focus on details that are directly related to the fallen. And obviously from the research material we've been sharing elsewhere, it's really focusing on this is where you can find information specifically about those individuals. Now, sometimes you're just not going to find a lot. It's just how it is. And so those stories may be on the shorter end. But we can also infer from where they serve to include some information that would be directly related to what they did. So in the Army, if you can find information down to the company level, you know what company that they were in, so that would serve for the Army or the Marines, then you can see if you can find details at some historic documentation at the company level. If not that, then battalion, if not that, regiment. And if you can't find anything on the regimental level, then at least you can find something about the division. But obviously, the more detailed unit you're working with, the more likely you're going to be talking about stuff that impacted that specific individual. For airmen, you may have a tail number that you can use, and you can use that to find information about that particular plane. And for Navy, obviously, a ship would be the one you'd want to be able to focus on. You can add information about that ship because that would have also been an experience of that person that you're writing about. Try to look for some local flavor where you can, information about the school they went to from that period, even if it's not directly related to them because they were at that school. That may be something that would fit in well with the story because they were at that location, and so they would have had that experience. Anything in the community, maybe you have an address and you look it up on a map and you say, wow, he was really close to this particular popular site, so he must have been very familiar with that. You could include something like that. And anybody that's relative that may have something of note that's worth mentioning, even though that's not directly their story, the fact that they're related to that person might be something of interest that you'd want to include. So, for instance, I remember doing a story once on an individual, and I think his brother was Robert Mitchum, the famous actor. So, obviously, you'd want to mention that in a story like this. Now, of course, we're saying try for 400 to 1,000 words, but I think we can make exceptions when a story is written by a family member. So, let me give you an example here. This story here about Charles Cannon Chick Winder was written by a family member. And I'm just scrolling down here, and you can see it's pretty long, longer than normal. And I would say that something like this makes sense to allow it because he's obviously writing more than just for an audience that's going to be reading this on a smartphone, but he's probably writing it for extended family. So once he's posted this, he can share it. So I would say that would be the exception to rule. If this is someone you're related to, however you want to write the story should be fine. Now let's look at it from the other side. What are some of the information that we can leave out? The audience here is people that are reading this at a gravesite or a memorial. They kind of want to know about that particular person. So some things we can leave out would be strategic level details. We just finished up doing the story of over 2,000 people who died at Pearl Harbor. In that case, perhaps we had someone whose story did not have a lot of information. We might feel, boy, we're just not putting a lot here. I've got to put something in here. But something strategic level like the situation between negotiations that the Americans were doing with the Japanese that were leading up to Pearl Harbor. That's really not relevant to this particular story. So almost always you would leave the strategic level details out. If you think the reader may have further interest with that individual, that strategic level details would be helpful, probably the best thing to do is do a hyperlink to an off-page article with more details about that. Related to that, I think most operational level details probably can be left out of the story. So what I mean by operational level is someone's at the Battle of Guadalcanal. Do they need to know the whole history of how the First Marines got there, or who was in command and the decisions they made, and what was going on off the shore in the Navy, or what were they doing in the air? If he's someone that's serving there on the front lines as a Marines, you can focus what his battalion was doing, what his company was doing, but I don't think you need to include the information above the unit that he was specifically in. In a famous battle like the Battle of Midway, you may be interested in giving a lot of background to what was going on and the different units that were there and the different ships and the different planes that were involved. But if you know what plane someone was on, you can focus on that plane and maybe their squadron without having to go into the operational details. So those could be left out, or put a link to an article on another website that would give the reader an opportunity to learn more about that. I would say that another thing that could be left out would be most controversial details. So mentioning someone is divorced is probably okay, but if we go into the messy details on the cause of it, probably inappropriate. We don't need to leave that sort of detail. Maybe someone got married and had a baby 3 months later. We don't need to point that out. That's not really relevant in most cases. So if it's controversial and salacious and not really something that you would put in an obituary, then I think we leave those out. The next thing, sometimes you come across a lot of rich information, letters, journals, and you may be tempted to just say, oh, I found this, I'm going to put this in. Oh, I found this is going to go in too. And before you know it, you've just got lots of details, lots of extra stuff. And again, our audience was not expecting to go so long with what they're reading. So I would recommend, if you have some excerpts that are representative of something, you can leave those in, but don't put in entire letters or entire journal entries unless you think that the audience would be so engaged that they'd be glad you did that. And if you have a way to reference those elsewhere, maybe you put them as an attachment, or if they're available on another website, that you do it that way. I guess a general rule of thumb to kind of end it at this is, if it's something you wouldn't expect to see in an obituary, then maybe we just leave it out, because an obituary is kind of the format that we're trying to follow here. We're trying to do a life sketch. And so it kind of feels out of place if all of a sudden there's like 8 poems that they wrote and you just put all 8 of them in there. It doesn't really flow with what we hope to achieve. So this is all advice. All our writers have their own voice, and it's kind of like when you're leaving flowers at a gravesite. We're not doing a standardized, everybody's flower arrangement has to look the same. Everyone brings their own skills and their own tone and their own personality, so we don't want to lose that. We just want to make sure that we have a good experience for those that are reading the stories, and as they read one story at a gravesite or memorial, they'll say, wow, that was cool, I'm going to read another one. And then they'll go on, and hopefully it'll enrich them and it'll honor many, many of the fallen. Because that's our whole idea is here. We want to honor these people that didn't get a chance to live their lives past the Second World War. And so your story is part of their legacy now going forward for the next number of decades. So we're hoping that you can do a story that is worthy of what they would wish to have. I know it's a little bit of a heavy responsibility, but I think given that we're not asking to write a mini biography, but we're just looking for an obituary, I think that's well within the abilities of all our writers to do a really respectful and complete and focused story about these World War II fallen. Thank you.